Right. And there'll be some music and then it starts.
All right. Make a little adjustment here.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday, July 21st. And I am super happy to have George Selgin with me. I've probably most of what I know, if not all of what I know about money, monetary policy, banking, and the way, certainly the history of banking, I have learned from either George or his partner in many of his books, Larry White. So it's a real pleasure to have George here. So thanks for joining us, George.
Oh, yeah, thank you for the fine compliment. I'm very happy to be here.
Good. So you have a new book out. You've got a lot of books out, but you have a brand new one out on the Great Depression, and specifically on kind of whether the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression. But first, I want to ask you. I mean, there are a lot of books on the Great Depression, even quite a few books from kind of free market advocates about the Great Depression. So, why another book?
Well, first of all, I don't see my book as a work of free market advocacy. I wrote it as a scholarly assessment of the New Deal, but specifically of the New Deal as a program for recovery. And so the purpose of the book was to focus on how the U.S. recovered from the Depression and how the New Deal contributed or held back that recovery. And I wrote it for University of Chicago Press. So even if I had tried to write a polemical book, I certainly wouldn't have gotten through the gamut that they made me and all their authors go through. They were very supportive of the effort, by the way. And there aren't many books about that, in fact, although there are many shelves worth of books on the New Deal and also on the Great Depression. I was surprised to discover that there was none that specifically addressed the question of how the U.S. recovered. And more than that, I was conscious of the fact from my learning on the subject, because I taught a course on the Great Depression
Okay.
for some years when I was a university professor. I was conscious of the fact that at least the popular explanations for how the U.S. got out of the Depression were completely unsatisfactory, and some of the scholarly explanations were at best incomplete. What I mean by the popular explanations are two extreme views. One is the view you alluded to, that the New Deal got us out of the Depression, and that is simply untenable, obviously untenable for those who know the chronology, because the New Deal, as an effective ongoing legislative program, had ended by 38. They had done all that they could think of doing to end the Depression, and by then they weren't able to get any more radical legislation through. Yet the Depression was still raging at the end of the 1930s. We still had over 17% of the labor force either on work relief or unemployed in 1939. The other popular explanation is World War II got us out.
Yeah.
Now, there's some truth to that, as I argue in the book, but it's not as simple as, oh, the government spent a lot and enlisted a lot of people who were unemployed in the armed services, and so the Depression ended. It's not that simple for the simple reason that the war ended. And when the war ended, the government spending ended, that we went back down to a percentage of government spending relative to GDP that was roughly what it was, putting all levels of government together, in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, all the soldiers came back looking for jobs. So the question, or rather, the answer to the question, how did the Depression end, has to refer to what happened after World War II ended. It can't just be what happened during the war. So these are some of the reasons why I felt a book on that issue was called for.
Great. So before we get into kind of the details of kind of what the New Deal was and how it contributed or not to recovery, maybe walk us through. I know this is going to have to be simplified. Kind of what caused the Great Depression? What led to the Great Depression, or what caused it? The 3-minute version.
Yeah. Well, I should say I don't even offer a 3-minute version in my book. I scrupulously avoid the question of what caused the Depression, except somewhat indirectly. I, of course, have to address some of its causes, because one controversial topic per book is enough. And a lot of people have debated forever the causes. But if I had to answer, as I apparently do, I would say that the biggest problem was the monetary disturbances and disarray that the First World War left the world in upon its termination. And to make a very long story short, many countries had inflated like mad during the war. The belligerents had, almost all of them, the US less so than other countries because it entered late. And most of them got off the gold standard. Once again, the US was an exception in that we didn't go off gold entirely, but we did suspend, restrict gold exports. All of this left the world with a money supply and price level, or money supplies and price levels, that were really not consistent with the classical gold standard, and more particularly with the actual availability of gold. You couldn't have the thing, you couldn't restore the old gold parities under those circumstances unless there was going to be a lot of deflation or there were going to be some devaluations. Now, all of these things, both of those things happened, but they didn't happen enough. There was resistance to both. England, for example, refused to devalue the pound. And clever people, politicians, came up with a third solution, a kind of gold standard on the cheap, where most countries would not hold their own gold reserves, but would instead participate in a so-called gold exchange standard, where the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, between them, became sort of central banks for all the other central banks. And what this did was to allow a limited amount of gold reserves to stretch further and sustain post-war money supplies and price levels at higher levels than would otherwise have been the case. The problem with that arrangement is if the people who are participating in it change their mind, for example, if the French decide they're going to cash in all their deposits at the Bank of England, they can send the whole house of cards tumbling down. And that's what happened in the late 1920s. And that precipitated a very severe worldwide deflationary depression that then most countries had to struggle to get out of. And we took longer than every one of them, except France, of the major economies, to get out.
So how did it play out in the United States? That is, what are the things that happened that kind of manifested the Great Depression from 29 on?
Well, there were, of course, we faced the usual macroeconomic consequences that essentially define a depression: a collapse in output and a collapse in employment. At one point in 1933, the peak level of employment plus workers on work relief was 25% of the labor force, a figure we haven't seen even half of since. So a lot of people are out of work and a lot of production is not happening. Factories are closed down. Also, behind all of this is a lack of spending. That's kind of driving it all. The other thing that is important in the US case specifically, because other countries experienced severe macroeconomic consequences. We had as well a severe banking crisis where many, many, many thousands of US banks failed. Now, we had a lot to begin with. We had over 20,000 banks going into this event, but a high proportion of them failed. And we had banking crises, not just failures, but situations where panic spread, culminating in a major banking crisis in February, March 1933, that only ended with the shutting down of all U.S. banks by Roosevelt as soon as he took office in March.
So, so what is it? So, to what extent did what Roosevelt did when he came to office in 33? To what extent did it moderate or improve situations? To what extent did it make it worse? I mean, he did some big. There were some big projects, particularly.
Yes, indeed. Well, the first thing Roosevelt did, and the first thing he had to do, which of course he hadn't been anticipating doing during his campaign or at any time the year before, was to deal with the banking crisis, because that broke out during the so-called interregnum between his election and his taking office. So he had to deal with that, and he dealt with it pretty astutely, as most historians agree. Shutting down the banks was an essential step, or at least uh, it was part of an overall plan for shutting them down and then gradually reopening them. That worked. It worked. When the banks were reopened, generally speaking, they were not faced with runs again. Various steps taken during the so-called national bank holiday had quelled people's fears, or, just as importantly, eliminated otherwise their incentive to run on banks. One of those steps, for example, was making it impossible for people to hoard gold. One of the main causes of runs in February, March was fear of devaluation. So people were running on the dollar to get gold, not necessarily running on banks because they thought they were about to fail. Of course, by first prohibiting gold ownership and also forcing people to bring the gold they'd taken out back, which they did in various ways that I talk about in my book. They eliminated this one incentive to run. But there were other steps. Of course, there was insuring bank deposits eventually. What's interesting about this successful addressing of the bank holiday from a historian's point of view is that the whole thing was actually planned, or most of it was planned, by the Hoover administration Treasury team, many of whom stayed on to help the new Roosevelt folks, who frankly had no plan at all coming into office. So what Roosevelt did wisely was to let the Hoover Treasury experts let them help, because he didn't have to do that. And then he helped execute the plan with his wonderful fireside chat, the first one, soothing depositors and all that. So these first steps mark the turnaround. It's very important to give the Roosevelt plus the Hoover administration credit for stopping the rot, for stopping the downturn of the economy. Because, of course, unless you did that, you couldn't even begin to talk about recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the early days. Unfortunately, subsequent New Deal policies, which is the real New Deal, the part that was not, as it were, a reaction to events that couldn't be anticipated, many of those proved counterproductive. And that's where the New Deal it really takes effect, and much of it is unhelpful. Not all of it. I talk in my book about programs, New Deal programs, that also were very, I think, constructive. Mm-hmm. So it isn't all bad.
So if we take the NRA, for example, maybe walk us through. This was a very controversial big part of that first administration, Roosevelt administration. What was it, and what was it trying to achieve, and what was it? What was its fate?
Yes, well, first of all, it's important to recognize that the New Deal comprised three sorts of legislative efforts. Roosevelt was very clear on this, aimed at the so-called three R's: recovery, relief, and reform. Recovery is obviously getting out of the Depression. Relief is providing aid and sustenance to the people who would be unemployed and not have a way to make a living. And reform was more long-term. And the New Deal involved elements of all three. I mention this as a prelude to saying that of the New Deal's original reform plans, there were two major components. The first, and actually the earliest to be implemented, was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. Yep. And its complement, because these were meant to work together, was the NRA. That's the National Recovery Administration, which was passed as part of the NIRA, or National Industrial Recovery Act. And the alphabet stuff, the alphabet soup, gets very confusing very quickly. The NRA was part of the Roosevelt team's efforts to get prices back up. Now, here we have to be very careful because it is true that, like many economists, the Roosevelt people felt that getting prices up was something they needed to do for recovery. The problem is that, unlike most economists, unlike Keynes, yes, but also unlike the Chicago School economists and many others, and unlike me, they didn't want to do this by making it possible for people to spend more. They were opposed, the FDR, the New Dealers, especially in those first years, they were opposed to both fiscal and monetary stimulus, which is the two main things that we think of today as, what you do for depression. And this is very important. Roosevelt was a fiscal conservative, first of all. Yes, his deficits were bigger than Hoover's, but as was the case with Hoover, these deficits were inadvertent. He wasn't willing to dispense with relief. And because the Depression was so bad, the government ended spending a lot on relief, including public works. But Roosevelt never believed that deficits per se were helpful. He thought that they hurt. So he tried to avoid them, except if it would make people, destitute. And on monetary policy, Roosevelt didn't believe in monetary expansion. That's what they called inflation in those days. Inflation was a word that meant monetary expansion, just as the Rothbardians use the term today. Most people don't use it that way. But Roosevelt was against inflation. So how do you get the price level up if you're not going to do fiscal stimulus, which is government spending, deficit spending, and you're not going to do monetary expansion, or you're trying not to do it? Well, you come up with all these other things that can get prices to rise, but not necessarily with the same consequences. And the NRA was one of those. The AAA was another. In both cases, the idea was to get prices up by restricting output. In the case of the NRA, industries were commanded to come up with industry-wide codes that the government would help enforce that would set prices higher, including the prices of labor, wage rates, and enforce those higher prices and wage rates. And the idea, and of course, to do this, what they're doing is forming legal cartels. Every industry is being cartelized. This was understood. It's not, and there's a very good book on this, by the way, called "The New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly." It was a very famous book that deals just with this odd aspect of the New Deal and the NRA. Anyway, they mandated higher prices and wage rates. But the problem with doing that without monetary or fiscal stimulus is nobody's earning more money. Firms aren't earning any more revenues. Mm-hmm. So how are they going to how are they going to pay workers higher wage rates? Well, they can only do it if they hire fewer labor hours. And that's exactly what happened. How are they going to sell their products for higher prices? Well, they can do it by restricting output, right? Because you don't have demand pushing up prices. You must have a supply contract to push them up.
Yep.
So the NRA is trying to get the economy going again by restricting output and employment, though they didn't see it as doing that.
Wow.
And in fact, the only reason unemployment didn't go sharply up under the NRA was because of another government program called work sharing that required firms to divvy up existing jobs into larger numbers of jobs with smaller hours or lower hours per week. So that hid the actual unemployment from the standard statistics. But in fact, if you look at total labor hours employed, they go down. And all this time, with all these people were looking for jobs, real wage rates had gone up. They were going up while people were lining up for jobs. And that can only happen with controls.
Yeah.
So that's the NRA. Most economists think it was a disaster. And even during the time, many people concluded that it was a disaster, ultimately including some New Dealers themselves, though not FDR. He tried to keep the thing alive.
And where does it come from economically? I mean, is this just off the cuff? Was there theory behind this? Because
there was a theory. Well, there was a theory, particularly, there were a couple things that played into it. One was the idea that, we're now in the managerial state and firms aren't working the way they used to. It's all about planning. So it's either they're going to plan or the government's going to plan, or they're going to have some combination of the two do the planning. So the planning mentality is very much at the forefront of the early New Deal. The people in charge or leading that phase of the New Deal are very much advocates of planning. And because they think it's going to happen one way or the other, and if it's going to happen, the government is more reliable in the saddle than the businessmen alone. And of course, in this particular case, the way they did it, the big businesses were very happy to cooperate because they say, oh, we can cartelize. The smaller firms are going to just have to go along with it because, as you would expect, the big firms were able to exercise more control of the process. But ultimately, they all got sick of it because it is the classic case of Bastiat's famous dictum that, that the state is that fictitious entity by which everybody tries to get rich at the expense of everybody else, through which everybody tries that. And that's what's happening. Everybody's trying to be a monopolist or a cartel. But everybody has to face the fact that the costs that they bear are rising along with everything else. Anyway, so the other theory that's fueling the NRA, and particularly the wage components of the NRA, is something called the high wage doctrine that emerged in the 1930s after the 2021 crisis, where the idea developed that if we pay workers higher wages, I'm doing this on purpose,
yeah,
then they'll have more to spend, and that will help achieve recovery. But wages is a terrible word because it has two different meanings. One is the total wage bill, or the number of dollars that are being received by workers, the total amount, which is their incomes. The other is the wage rates, which is how much you're having to pay workers per hour. Now, if you increase wage rates, you don't necessarily increase the wage bill. In fact, unless somehow firms can be earning more revenue, the only way they can raise wage rates is by hiring fewer labor hours. And so unless you have an independent policy that is providing more spending, that is achieving more spending and increasing total revenues, in a depression, the firms are not going to have a lot of profits that they can dig into in order to pay higher wage rates. So you end up with more unemployment. It was a very stupid policy, quite frankly, because you can draw the supply and demand curves on the table napkin and figure out that raising wage rates doesn't give you more employment. And on the contrary, nevertheless, it caught on. Partly caught on because of Henry Ford paying workers more per hour than
Yep.
usual, and the idea developed. See, they can all now buy Fords.
Yeah.
But it weren't able to buy Fords because Ford was paying them high salaries. They were able to buy Fords because other people were buying Fords and otherwise spending a lot more money, and the revenues were good, and Ford could afford to pay the higher wage rates. And so, anyway, very bad theory. I have a paper about it.
Yes, you brought that
I
up. Say
wrote it.
something about why Ford raised wages. Why did he raise? He doubled them, right?
Yes, well, because he realized that he could get good labor for that product, that those wage rates. Remember that Ford is also a pioneer with advances in assembly line technology. So his workers are more productive than other workers because they have this technology or management uh, uh, arrangements that allow them to be more productive and be worth those higher wage rates. So you really he could afford to do it because his plants were productive. Anyway, so you had all these theories that did inform the NRA and also the AAA. The AAA tried to get agricultural prices up by telling farmers to quit farming so much, by paying them to reduce their their acreage, and by kill their piglets and etc. And of course, that will raise prices, but it does so by reducing agricultural output. And when you reduce agricultural output, you hire fewer workers.
Yep.
The people who really got screwed, if you pardon the expression, but it's quite appropriate here, by the AAA, the most, were the poor shareholders and agricultural laborers, particularly in the Cotton South. You had many of these persons who were didn't legally, some of them were entitled, the shareholders were entitled to part of the payments for reducing output, but guess what? The farm owners took it all. And so these people ended up with no jobs and no opportunities to find them anywhere down south where they're now farming less. And they ended up going to the urban cities and usually joining the rolls of the unemployed unless they were lucky and got work relief. And the Black African American families, many of them were part of that exodus. It was a great tragic consequence of that component of the New Deal that's often forgotten about.
Yeah. So the NRA ultimately is ruled unconstitutional. Is that right by the courts?
Yes, they were both ruled unconstitutional, the AAA and the NRA. The AAA was ruled unconstitutional because of what was considered a discriminatory tax uh, that was used to raise the money with which farmers were paid to not farm. And by the way, they recreated another AAA after that one was struck down that avoided that particular constitutional issue. The NRA was struck down on somewhat similar constitutional grounds, particularly concerning the uh, whether the actions of the NRA, of the National Recovery Administration, were justified or warranted by the Commerce Clause, and they found that it was not. So that disappeared, and thank goodness wasn't revived. Nothing quite like it has ever been tried again since. By the way, only one other country implemented reforms that resembled to address the Depression that resembled the NRA. And I think I mentioned that France was the only other country that recovered as slowly, or perhaps a little more slowly than the USA. And guess what? They were the ones.
Yep.
So there's a lot of evidence that that kind of planning solution to the New Deal didn't work. And there are some economists who contest this, but the vast majority, then and now, think the NRA was a big mistake and often the worst mistake of the New Deal. I think it was probably the worst mistake. I hope we get a chance, by the way, to talk about the positive things, because there were some. I don't want people to think that I'm only cataloging the New Deal's bad attempts. But it was certainly one of the worst things that was done.
So what happens, AAA, NRA, they make things in a sense worse, not better, and yet the economy doesn't do worse. So what is going on? Is there positive going on that is offsetting kind of in terms of the effects?
Well, most of the positive recovery is during the very first early period. And there's actually a big post-bank holiday uplift of the economy, and things are looking pretty good for a while. But it's actually after the NRA and the AAA kick in. It takes. There's a little bit of a delay, but that recovery starts to peter out.
Hmm.
Starts to peter out. Now, there is afterwards, there is another period of recovery. But I would argue, and I think the evidence supports the argument, that the recovery that took place overall, beyond the initial phase where you have the advantage of getting the bank situation resolved,
Hmm.
which is very positive. Then, when the NRA first is announced and it's being expected, you have another little mini boom. You have a mini boom, but most economists think that that's because there was a lot of anticipatory buying by producers, stocking up on inventories of inputs and other things because they know that the prices are all going to be going up. And then it peters out already in the fall. You have the new dealers themselves noting that, okay, now things are starting to look a little bit shaky. But what starts happening then that is driving the recovery from that point on to the big Roosevelt downturn of 37, 38 is a factor that for which the New Deal is only partially responsible, and that's gold.
Hmm.
What we started talking about how lack of gold was part of the problem that caused the Great Depression, and that's absolutely true. What many people don't realize was that the United States was facing an inundation of gold after 1933, or actually mostly after January 1934, to be precise. That's when Roosevelt finally devalued the dollar, and that initially caused some increase in gold inflows into the United States, because devaluing the dollar means you're raising the price of gold and making it worth more. But the main factor, that has a temporary effect for reasons I discuss in my book. Devaluation won't keep gold inflowing forever, even if other countries don't devalue in turn. But there's something else going on. And this is the biggest driver of the recovery between 1934 and 1937. It's Europe's war clouds. It's Hitler, mainly Hitler. Hitler becomes chancellor around this, actually a little bit before this time. And increasingly there's fear of war. And these jitters become the main reason why gold starts heading in large amounts, even larger than devaluation itself would have promoted, to the United States. And all that gold, that is monetary stimulus.
Hmm.
But it's not on purpose. It's not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is passively having to accept not gold itself, actually, because now that gold ownership is illegal, even the Fed isn't allowed to have gold. Instead, the Treasury buys all the gold that comes into the country and gives the Fed gold certificates, little pieces of paper saying, we have this gold, and that becomes the Fed's asset. Anyway, the Fed is passively allowing this. It's not engaging in any monetary stimulus on purpose. And here's the biggest irony. This is helping to restore spending. This is doing what the NRA isn't doing and the AAA isn't doing. And it is limiting the damage done by those programs, which would otherwise be quite counterproductive. But then guess what happens? The government officials in the Treasury and elsewhere, remember, they don't like inflation, monetary expansion. So they don't like this.
Huh.
And they actually start absolutely fearing that this is going to cause inflation. Sorry, they don't mind prices rising, but they say this is inflation. What they're really worried about is monetary expansion, and particularly that the banking system is going to expand. They're sitting on tons of reserves, and that's going to cause another a stock market boom, and it's all going to lead to a crash. So you might say they're very Austrian about it, but the sad reality is that here you had the one thing that's really driving recovery is gold coming in, doing what a gold standard's supposed to do, right? You got low prices, you got gold comes in, and it got things going again. They decided they needed to do something about it. And so they did two things. The Treasury and the Fed separately did these anti-gold inflation things, kind of with each not exactly talking to the other. So you get a double dose of efforts to keep the gold from resulting in more spending. The Fed doubles reserve requirements, doubles them. And at the same time, the Treasury starts sterilizing for a period gold inflow. So they're not giving the Fed the gold certificates for that much for gold for an extensive. Between these two things, and also some government austerity, but mostly I think the sterilization first of all, and then the reserve requirements, the recovery stops because the thing driving it stops. There's no more gold stimulus, and that precipitates the great so-called Roosevelt recession of 1937, 1938, which wipes out a huge part, not all, but a big chunk of the recovery, the progress toward recovery that had occurred in the preceding years. And it's all on New Dealers because they were the ones who put the brakes on that one important source of spending stimulus, gold inflows. It's very tragic. By the way, Keynes was very good on the Depression. I know people hated when I say that, but he was for the most part. If the New Dealers had listened to Keynes, we would have had a much more rapid recovery. Keynes noted this gold inflow. He noted the connection between it and Stalin, by the way, was another. Between Hitler and Stalin, they did more for recovery at this time than Roosevelt. I'm only being semi-facetious when I say that. Stalin was subsidizing gold mining. And so their mines were putting out tons of gold, much more than they had in the 20s. And a lot of it was ending up as part of that flow to the US via Europe. And so anyway, Keynes is noting this, say, what? This is ironic, but this is the thing that's helping the recovery. And what he didn't anticipate when he wrote about that was that the US authorities would respond to this with policies designed to stop it. We can't have all this gold. and I'm absolutely not exaggerating. So this was a tragic response to what would have been. And by the way, I'm not being radical here. Christina Romer is a very good economic historian who's written all about how the gold inflows were the main thing driving recovery. And she's not, a crazy libertarian or anything like that. But this was very tragic. So after that, by 38, as the economy is getting out of this secondary depression, but by then the New Deal kind of peters out. There's no more efforts, and the parts of the old deal are being dismantled, they're found unconstitutional. And so that's why we end up with 17 point something percent of the labor force either on work relief or unemployed. I want to add a footnote here, Jan, if I may. There's some people who say, oh, you shouldn't count the people on work relief as being, among the unemployed. And I don't. They're not unemployed. They're working. But they should be counted if you're trying to assess how the recovery is going. because work relief is a substitute for recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And Roosevelt and company were very clear on this. They said, look, these jobs are temporary emergency jobs. It's a way of putting money in people's pockets, but it's relief. It's not recovery. Recovery is getting them back to work in the factories that are shuttered and getting those factories working again. That's recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that did not happen, had not happened as of 1939.
So from 39 on, is it basically a war economy that kind of generates the jobs and the
Yes, it starts with the outbreak of the war in Europe, where there's a very sharp increase in the demand for war material in Europe, and the U.S. is happy to supply it. We have the means, and that helps. That starts a recovery. That starts a recovery, and of course, it's not long before we start to militarize, even prior to Pearl Harbor.
Sure.
And then Pearl Harbor, of course, causes U.S. military spending to absolutely skyrocket. And that in turn means that we have this temporary, for the time being, the Depression is over because millions of workers of unemployed who would have been unemployed or who are on work relief, they are drafted into the armed services or they volunteer. And so that's the end of unemployment as far as the statistics are concerned. And likewise, you have now a great increase in output of war material, plants being reopened or established, newly established for the purpose of building airplanes and such, ships. And so the Depression's over, except the war ends the Depression as long as the war continues.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as the war ends, the government applied shock therapy, as it were. It completely cut back wartime spending. Yes, there were things like the GI Bill and all, but the fact is that total spending on all levels declined to the share of GDP it had constituted before the war, that is, before the European war. And of course, all those workers are coming back demanding jobs. So in order to explain the recovery, you have to explain why you didn't have another depression as soon as the war ended, or what you didn't see the economy lapse back into depression. And that's a serious question. One way to gauge how serious a question it was and why it's not obvious is by noting that the administration's economists, first, especially this is the end, towards the end of the war, it's still the Roosevelt administration. Now most of those economists are Keynesians. The Keynesians have slowly gained importance, but it should be noted that they were not important during most of the New Deal. Keynes had hardly any influence directly or indirectly on the New Deal. But now there are plenty of Keynesians in the government. And they are, for the most part, almost all of them, predicting a terrible calamity, a depression in many cases predicted to be worse than it had been in the 30s, unless the government gets peacetime spending up as high as wartime spending had been, particularly deficit spending. We are going to see a depression that is as bad or worse than in the 30s. Well, of course, shock therapy was what they were arguing against, right? We can't just stop spending and not do anything else. We can't just liberate prices. They were arguing that all of this would be a disaster. With some good reason, because unless something changed, right? Unless there was some big change that had taken place between 1939 and the end of the war, some change that would not cause conditions to revert to where they'd been, it was sensible enough to fear that you'd go right back to where you started. And yet they were all horribly, well, They were all fortunately wrong
Yep.
because there was nothing. The unemployment rate never went much above 4%, which by the Keynesians' own estimates, it never was far above after the war, immediately after the war, never rose far above what they would consider full employment.
Employment, yeah.
So it was remarkable that we avoided that. Something had to change. And one of the things I try to explain in my book is what else happened
Yeah.
during the war that allowed the economy, instead of having a renewed depression, to actually take off right after the war when the government stops all this spending.
So what was it?
What it, I'm glad you asked. What it was, I believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence for it, what it was a change in the government's attitude toward business. Major change. And there are books about this, and books and articles that are very good that I cite, because one of the things that interfered with recovery in the 30s, and we mentioned some others, but one of the others, especially toward the last phase of the New Deal, was what Bob Higgs calls regime uncertainty, which is all the experimentation and
Yeah.
the unpredictability of government policy
Sounds
combined.
familiar these days. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, very much so. Combined with outright fear of the hostility demonstrated by the Roosevelt administration and Roosevelt personally towards businessmen, and his rhetoric and other things. It got very, very nasty. And there were some policies that went along with the nasty rhetoric, that is, as it were, implemented the nasty rhetoric. The rhetoric was mostly aimed at big businessmen, but the policies tended to affect businessmen more generally. So there was a lot of reason for businessmen to not be confident in the future, to not be confident enough to invest, and with the hope of recouping of profiting from the investment. And so what happens in the 30s is investment absolutely collapsed for the whole decade. There was, especially if you are looking at net investment, right? Not just replacement of depreciating capital, but growth. There was none. It was essentially zero. Sometimes it was negative. And that remained true during the war because there's no private investment during the war. So something has to happen to make businessmen confident again. And the war did that. Now, by the way, Keynes was very good on this. Keynes was scolding Roosevelt for scaring businessmen. And he was saying to them, look, everybody, all economists agreed, you got to get investment going if you're going to have a recovery. You can't just have consumer goods being consumed because you got to make stuff. You got to get the factories working again. So they all agreed on that. But Keynes was particularly scornful of New Deal policies that intimidated businessmen or otherwise made it difficult for them to be optimistic about the future. He couched it in the general theory, especially in terms of what he called animal spirits. He said, look, the way you have businessmen do their thing, investing, is you can't have them thinking about what can go wrong. They have to have this optimism. It's like, you can't go out and you can't live well if you're constantly thinking you're going to die any minute, right? But he said, businessmen have to not fear the future. And he said to Roosevelt, basically, quit picking on them, coddle them, make them feel happy, make them feel proud. He said all of these things. It's very, very good because it helps us understand how the recovery happened. Because World War II comes along, American entry in particular, and all of a sudden the administration is,
we need them.
We need them. And we need to have them cooperate in the war effort. And the next thing you know is all the businessmen are piling into Washington, taking power. and they produce the planes. The record of the production under the cordial, let's say, détente between the government and business, the result of this is an incredible production of wartime materials, all the planes Roosevelt promised and more. But there's more to it than that. The New Dealers themselves, working with these businessmen, start saying, hey, maybe they're not so bad. And other people are looking at all this saying, maybe capitalism isn't dead after all. And so everything changes. This is not a small change. It goes from one extreme of hostility to business and believing that capitalism is doomed and all that, to the beginnings of what becomes the military-industrial complex, which is where, if anything, the government and business are much too cozy.
Yep.
But as far as recovery is concerned, this is a very good development. The long-run implications may not have been so great, but for the recovery, it means that businessmen end the war on an upbeat view of the future, and investment takes off like a rocket. And so basically, it's like scissors. The government spending is going, I got to do it backwards. Government spending is going, and private investment's going, and that's why you didn't need the government peacetime spending that the Keynesians thought would be necessary, because private investment has taken off.
Yep.
So I think this aspect of the war, so you can still tell a story where World War II helps end the Depression, but it is not a simple story of government spending. It's a story of, more importantly, for the longer haul, for the post-war revival, the big change isn't the spending. It's not the lasting change. It's the change in attitudes that gives businessmen the, warm, fuzzy feeling that Keynes thought they needed if they were going to start doing their investment thing again. So I think that's the part of the recovery story that both critics of the New Deal, both the conventional criticisms of the New Deal and the champions of the New Deal arguments in favor of the New Deal omit. And by the way, it has to be said that this change in attitude is part of the abandonment of the New Deal. It's not a New Deal. Mm-hmm. And Keynesianism helps here too, Yaron, because remember, Keynesianism is saying just have the government stimulate. Nowadays they put the Keynesian emphasis on fiscal stimulus, but Keynes himself thought monetary stimulus was, another possibility. But for businessmen, this kind of thing, changing interest rates, having the government spend more, it's not as oppressive as all that New Deal stuff.
Yeah.
It's not interfering with their decision making. It's not as scary. So for businessmen, they may not like deficit spending, they don't like inflation, but they would rather have the government pushing and pulling that one big lever than micromanaging them or scaring them to death. Yeah. So for business investment, the Keynesian revolution, which is taking hold, that is the idea that the main way you should combat recessions is by government spending or monetary stimulus. For them, it's a big relief, that change. And we need to remember that when we're being critical of Keynes.
Did that affect also the Fed? That is, did that also cause a change in terms of the Fed's monetary policy or the attitude towards monetary policy?
The truth is that monetary policy never really deliberately contributed much to recovery, even after the war. After the war, the main concern of the monetary authorities and the Truman administration was inflation and keeping a lid on it. Because, of course, prices had been kept down by wartime controls. And once those controls were lifted, the tendency was for them to go up, particularly when you had all this private spending is kicking in. So you can't count on the reduction in government spending. By the way, the government went into surplus very quickly after the war, and fiscal surpluses, which was the Keynesians thought, this is the last thing you're going to be able to get away with without trouble. So the fact is that you had renewed fiscal and monetary austerity, as it were, relatively tight regimes after World War II. So neither of those stimulus sources was contributing to the recovery. And that made the recovery of private investment spending all the more important. Now, it should be said that many people think that what was driving all this was consumer demand, because consumers were forced to save a lot during the war. Remember, the government is spending a lot, and it's ending up in consumers' pockets.
Mm-hmm.
But they saved a lot because there weren't as many household goods to produce with all the productive machinery of the economy oriented towards wartime output. And so one theory says, okay, after the war, they dissaved. They took all these savings and they went on shopping spree. But that actually didn't happen. Their savings rate fell after the war. They weren't saving as much as a percentage of consumption, but they didn't dissave after the war. And that's all the more evidence that it's really the investment side of things that's sustaining the recovery. And it's what's allowing these people to buy more without dissaving.
Yep.
So anyway,
if we go back to the beginning, there's certain people who I think we know who would say nothing should have been done. Right? These things take care of themselves.
yeah, yeah,
You shouldn't do anything.
yes.
So what's your view? I mean, in terms of you're in 1933, it is what it is. What needs to be done?
Well, I think plenty needed to be done. I don't. That argument makes little sense. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that a completely free market economy with a proper gold standard and a good free banking system of the sort I like
Yep.
had been in effect, you might say doing nothing should suffice. But then again, in that sort of system, I think you probably wouldn't have had the disaster that you.
Yeah, you don't get it. Exactly.
Well, but so we had a disaster. Why? Well, we have had monetary arrangements that had been badly muddled, as I described early on.
Mm-hmm.
And those weren't going to change instantly. So, if you're going to do nothing, you have to start doing nothing after you have a good economic system in place, not while you still have a lousy one in place, and certainly not while the lousy one has just caused a massive collapse. That's not the time to do nothing, because, like it or not, the same government that, as we're assuming for the sake of argument, created the circumstances that allowed the economy to collapse, is also the only agency in a position to try to fix things, that is, to correct its own mistakes. The banking system isn't one that's going to automatically recover. The debts that have suffered from deflation aren't automatically going to just go away. The unemployment is not going to quickly resolve itself through deflation because of rigid contracts, especially debt contracts, but also because of other kinds of price inflexibilities. Some of them are not part of the market system, but are not going to go away. The government had an absolute responsibility to take steps to help end the recession. And those steps, many of them that were necessary, were not going to happen otherwise. One of the programs that was a good New Deal program, in my opinion, perhaps the best, setting aside dealing with the banking crisis, but this is the New Deal proper we're talking about, was the creation of the home loan home loan mortgage corporation. I always botch this up. And homeowners loan corporation, HOSC. Now, what this thing does is you have all these debtors with mortgages, and I won't go into the structure of the mortgages, but suffice to say, these weren't going to be easy to refinance. And they're all underwater. And the lenders are in trouble because all they can get by foreclosing is property that's price of which is down and impossible to sell. And that's not going to help them. What you ideally needed was refinancing, restructure all these mortgages.
Yeah.
Pretend they'd write them the way they might have been written if the depression had been anticipated. Well, that's what the HOLC did very cleverly. Uh, they swapped their own, the new agency swapped its own agency bonds for the mortgages on terms that the mortgage lenders were bound to consider better than foreclosing or holding these non-performing loans. And then they refinanced the mortgages on better terms, including introducing 30-year new loans with its long loan terms, amortized terms. And they managed to do it. They are relying on taxpayers because the key to this, they're relying on implicit guarantees on loans and the interest. So there's risk and taxpayers are bearing it. But guess what? It's a macroeconomic crisis. It's a perfect example of a public good because if this works, taxpayers are going to be among the beneficiaries, right? Helping get out of a depression. And it works very well. In fact, the government didn't lose any money at all. It might have, but World War II raised the prices of mortgage property. And eventually the thing came out with very low cost. It didn't actually profit. Some people claim it profited, but if you get the accounting right, it lost a little bit of money, but did a heck of a lot of good. It kept a lot of people in their homes. It saved a lot of the mortgage lenders. And by doing these things, it did help the recovery. It was one of the best New Deal programs, in my opinion, because it's essentially dealing with price rigidities that the marketplace wasn't able to easily overcome. And they had a similar program for farm mortgages, but the statistics don't allow us to conclude that it was as successful. Moreover, it was kept in place long after, in one form or another. It became almost a permanent program, and then it ended up wreaking havoc with agriculture. And the whole thing went blotto in the 1980s, as people predicted it would, if it wasn't eliminated after having done what it should have done in the 30s. So you don't want these things to be perpetual.
Well, that is true of kind of the 33, 34 bank regulations, right? I mean,
well, those were meant to be permanent all along. The AAA, some programs were supposed to be temporary. The AAA was supposed to be temporary. Roosevelt went back on his word on it. He signed it off as a temporary measure and then said, "Oh, we never thought this would be temporary." He was very clear about it. And I think the AAA, in its post-New Deal versions, of course, it ended up being the basis for the whole drama and ordeal of farm subsidies that were still not completely passed. Anyway, the banking legislation was permanent, and it was sad because the more astute observers of the situation understood that the reason the U.S. banking system was so weak and so many banks failed was the same reason why we had so many in the first place, which was the lack of branch banking, which countries with strong banking systems allowed their banks to branch, usually nationwide. And most countries that suffered from the Depression didn't have banking crises because they had better banking systems. Canada, by the way, was a very good example. So this was not simply a matter of having a central bank that did the right thing. Canada had none until 1935. Anyway, what the banking law did was to treat deposit solution as a way of propping up these weak banks, because of course, if you're fully insured, you don't worry about your bank being weak, even if you know it is, right? You know this is the same goddamn bank that same sort of bank that collapsed a few years ago. Nothing's basically changed. It's under-diversified. It can't stand a shock to the farm sector in which it deals. But it's okay. It's okay because we have insurance. The alternative, of course, was to allow branching, but there was Carter Glass wanted branching. Henry Stiegel was totally opposed to it, so we ended up with this. Roosevelt didn't like deposit insurance, and he fought the legislation that deposit insurance component of the
Hmm.
1933 Banking Act, he fought it till the 11th hour
Well,
when he finally realized that the deck was stacked against him, that he didn't want to veto the whole bill, and he probably would have faced his veto being overturned. So he relented, and of course, being a wise politician, he then took credit for deposit insurance as if he'd wanted it all along, but he didn't really. He never liked the idea. Truman, interestingly, also hated deposit insurance
oh,
originally, but by the end, during the banking crisis, he was saying, "Well, maybe this will be the lesser of two evils." So between the two of them, it was Hoover who showed some inclination to support deposit insurance, and not FD. And by the way, when I say this about FDR, that's not one of my criticisms of him. I think that his criticisms of deposit insurance, which we should really call deposit guarantees because it's not run like insurance, I
yeah.
think they were perfectly sound, and many economists would say that they were perfectly sound.
Well, and the consequences were felt in the 80s to 2008 and are still being felt, right?
Yeah, eventually, badly designed insurance systems anyway tend to lead to trouble. We had dozens of them before the Great Depression, and they all went belly up.
Yep.
They were state depositors; they all failed, and so that was part of what was informing both Truman and Roosevelt's negative attitude towards insurance. They'd seen what it had done in various state attempts. So it was perfectly reasonable for somebody who was, and Roosevelt was, he was where he understood banking. He was no economist, but banking he was familiar with, and so I think his views on banking were quite sound. But he accepted this as the best that could be had in order to get the whole banking bill through. I write about the other components of the Banking Act, including this famous Glass-Steagall component, separating investment and commercial banking, but only to point out that those things did nothing to help end the Depression either.
No.
Deposit insurance may have contributed to stabilizing the banking system. It's controversial whether it was really that important for that. But the other components of the 33 Banking Act did nothing to help the recovery, because the things they dealt with weren't part of the problem at the time.
All right, so we've got a few questions here. Let's go to those and see. Okay, Wes asks, what are common misconceptions, fallacies around banking and financing that drive you crazy?
Fallacies around banking and financing.
Finance, I guess, generally, finance and banking that drive you crazy. Yeah, misconceptions.
Oh goodness. Well,
Let me
um,
count the ways, huh?
I have to be very selective here because there's a long list of things that drive me crazy in banking, about banking and otherwise. I think the biggest one, though, is the belief that only a central banking system can be stable. That would be my number one. It's a belief that is, if not completely uninformed by history, is informed by a very limited knowledge of history, including people looking back at U.S. history and concluding that all our troubles before the Fed were things that could not have been solved without creating the Fed. Now, apart from the fact that the Fed did not perform very well at all, especially in its first few decades, and didn't perform any better than the preceding systems, really, in almost any criterion you could pick. The fact is that the pre-Fed problems of the United States banking and currency system can all be traced easily, without a shoehorn or anything, to misguided legislation. It has to be remembered that we did not have a free market banking system at any time in the U.S. history.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, we had various experiments with regulation, first at the state level mainly, and then mainly or at least as much on the federal level. And if you examine these regulations, both before the Civil War and since, you find a lot of stuff that was god awful and that played very important parts in all of the financial banking problems, currency problems. We mentioned the lack of branch banking. That was the main reason why we didn't have a uniform currency before the Civil War. It wasn't because we had a lot of separate independent banks that issued banknote currency. Uh, we know from other countries' experience that you could have that. You wouldn't have 30,000 of them, but you might have dozens, and their notes would circulate at par everywhere in the nation because they had branches where they could be redeemed everywhere in the nation. The US didn't allow that. So we had this ridiculous system with thousands of banks and notes that were worth different amounts depending on where they were and all that. But I could say the same. You name me, I used to say this to my money and banking students. That's another course I taught for a long time. If you can name a US banking or currency crisis and explain how it happened without attaching an important role to some stupid regulation, I will give you an A in this class. You won't have to do any more work.
Yep.
No, you can't do it. No competent economic historian can do it. None. So what bugs me is the inattention both to the details of U.S. history and to experience elsewhere, which many U.S. economists are very parochial, and that includes foreigners trained in the U.S. in economics. They know a little tiny bit, enough to be dangerous, about U.S. monetary history and nothing at all about other countries. You can't be a good monetary and banking economist or historian if you don't know about the wide range of different experiences to be encountered beyond U.S. borders. You just can't. So that drives me nuts. That's number one in my list. Do I need to come up with more?
No, I think that's good. So
Okay.
to do this, what would be a good source, one of your books or articles that cover kind of the history of free banking in other countries and the history in the United States, so that people can dig deeper if they want to?
Well, the best book on experiences around the world is a book edited by Kevin Dowd, published by a new edition recently published by the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, which we would have published at Cato, by the way. We had started the project, but a chapter got in there that the person in charge, meaning me, did not like, and Kevin wouldn't take it out, so we had a parting of the ways. Anyway, that chapter is on banking in Manchuria. I highly recommend the book, except for that chapter, which gets what free banking is all wrong. And it's called The Experience of Free Banking. And so that's a very good place to start. It goes through a lot of episodes of relatively free. Of course, none of these systems are perfectly free of regulation, but relatively free banking systems and how they performed. And I think it includes a chapter, did originally include a chapter on the United States that talks about all the ways in which we did not have free banking, even though we had laws that were called free banking laws.
Yep.
That would be probably the most important. On the Scottish system, of course, I'm bound to recommend, that's one of the most well-studied, Lawrence White's classic study, Free Banking in Britain. That's all on the Scottish system. Otherwise, on the United States, I would recommend a book of essays I put together called Money, Free and Unfree, published with the Cato Institute. And that has a lot of chapters on various aspects of U.S. banking and currency history. So those three, I think, would cover things very well.
Great. All right. Remo asks, can you explain how bond collateral banking worked and how it contributed to the Great Depression?
Well, okay. Bond collateral banking, this is, I think, we mainly want to talk about bond collateral banking goes back before the Civil War. In fact, all those free banking laws that people confuse with truly free banking, about a dozen states had these laws. All their banks were required to back their banknotes, their circulating currency, with specific securities, which included typically state government bonds, naturally, because the states wanted to sell their securities, but sometimes included other sorts of bonds. And those caused trouble in those so-called free banking systems. But let's not go into that. During the Civil War, the Union government did two things. They created a new system of national banks, and they eventually taxed state banks out of the currency business. So the only banknote currency from then on until the Fed was notes of national banks, and they all had to be secured by United States government bonds. Once again, by the way, that big part of the motivation is not making the banks safe. It's financing the government, the Union war effort. So keep that in mind. Now, what happened in that system was kind of very different from what happened in the state systems, because in the state systems, a lot of the securities that banks were required to hold turned into junk, and it was the main cause of free bank failures. In the case of the national bank currency, something opposite but just as bad happened, which is this. So the currency supply is tied to the availability of certain U.S. government securities that have to back the notes. The banks have to buy these securities. In fact, they have to have more than 100% face value of securities to cover their note issues. What happens is, after the war ends, for decades, the government's running surpluses. So the availability of these securities is shrinking. On the other hand, the economy is growing, and it needs more currency, not less. And so you have essentially the conditions for a sort of supply-demand train wreck, where demand's growing, supply is secularly shrinking. Just to give you an idea of the secular story, by 1890, the supply of national banknote currency is half what it was in 1880 in a growing economy. Okay. Now, economies are very capable of adapting to a lot of things. They can handle a lot. And so there was some long-run secular adaptation. What there wasn't was a capacity of the system to deal with short-run spikes in demand, particularly those that happened in the harvest season, when there'd be a big peak demand for currency to pay migrant workers who, of course, don't have bank accounts. And since it was, given the high price of the rare securities, increasingly rare securities, banks had to secure notes, and the fact that made it absolutely prohibitively costly for banks to acquire the necessary collateral to meet temporary peaks in demand for currency, like the harvest time peak. So every time the harvest would occur, and with increasing severity over time, you tended to have spikes in interest rates. Why? Because when the farmer comes to his bank and says, I need currency to pay my workers, and the bank says, we can't issue any more of our own IOUs, he says, okay, I'll have some legal tender. I'll take some of your reserves out, which he's entitled to do. And that leads to a contraction of credit. Yeah. So credit tightens, interest rates go up. Now, in the good years, that's all that happens. Interest rates seasonally spike. But in some occasions, you had severe currency panics and shortages. 1884, 1893, the worst of all in 1907. In each case, there were other aggravating factors. But resting behind it all is this inelastic supply of currency that is a consequence of the bond deposit requirement combined with the increasing scarcity of eligible securities. Yep. So now that explains crises leading up to the Fed, which was established for the purpose of supplying an elastic currency. There's no magic behind this reform. Basically, the newly established 12 Federal Reserve banks were exempt from the bond collateral requirement. And so the other banks could come up to the Fed with their other assets, commercial paper mainly, which were not eligible as backing for notes. And they could say, please, sir, here's my commercial paper. Would you discount it for me and give me some Federal Reserve notes so I don't have to dip into my reserve? That's how the Fed worked. Wow. It's rather like the scene on people are now too young to remember the movie Misery with Kathy Bates and
Mhm.
James Caan. He's a writer, famous writer, gets in a car crash, and she happens to rescue him, and she's a big fan. She's obsessed with him. Well, he starts, and she loves taking care of him as he's recuperating. But at one point, he looks like he's ready to get out, so she smashes his legs with a sledgehammer to keep him around a little more, so she can cure him longer. And that's sort of what the federal government did with banking. They smashed the legs of the national banks, and then Kathy Bates, in the form of the Fed, comes along and saves
Leaves the
saves
day. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, but you asked about the Great Depression, and at that point, the Federal Reserve is starting to take over currency supply. So, although it's technically true that the national banks might have done more to avert the depression had they been able to issue more of their notes, the fact is that by the time of the Great Depression, their note issuing ability is very, very limited. And the government has come to rely almost exclusively, not quite, on the Federal Reserve to supply all currency, not just emergency currency, right? It's taking over as the sole supply. By 1935, the last national banknotes are issued. But here's an interesting footnote. At some point during the Depression before 35, a law was passed that relaxed the bond requirement. So they really did relax. And guess what? It helped. There was a substantial increase in the supply of national banknotes on collateral that wasn't the usual bonds. But unfortunately, it was too little to make any big difference. I've always wanted to write a paper about this episode because, in my opinion, if they had said to the national banks or to the state banks that still existed, for that matter, they could have said, you can issue all your banknotes that you want, it would have alleviated the crisis of the early 1930s.
Yeah.
It would have helped. But the Fed said, no, you leave it to us. We'll supply all the good Federal Reserve notes that are needed,
Yeah.
which, of course, as Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz have demonstrated at great length, it did not do. It did not do its job of meeting the needs of the early 1930s, avoiding a monetary collapse.
So I have a few more questions here from listeners. But that uh, sparked in me a question of this idea of the notes being backed by government bonds. What are your thoughts on this new legislation around stablecoins?
Well, here I'm going to appear to contradict myself. I wrote a paper a few years ago while at Cato called what was it called? Anyway, a narrow path to efficient stablecoins or something like that,
Mhm.
where I argued that rather than suppress stablecoins altogether, the government should embrace them, specifically by allowing stablecoin issuers to take part in the Federal Reserve's clearing and settlement system, to have master accounts, and treat stablecoins like so many banknotes of yore. But since I knew they were never going to just allow them to do that without regulating them otherwise, I said, well, let's at least, allow them to do it as long as they hold 100% reserves at the Fed.
Mhm.
100%. So I said, let's have narrow banking for stablecoins.
Yep.
A compromise. Um, now, this isn't bond deposit, right? This is 100% reserves. It's not the same thing. But it does, of course, mean that you can't issue stable coins for which you don't have full reserves. Because one of the big problems with stable coins as they've existed is that, in fact, many of them claim to have 100% reserves,
Yeah.
but they don't. They
Yeah.
don't. They have other stuff. They have cash equivalents. And it turns out the closer you look at these things, the less they look equivalent to cash. And you've had, of course, a few disasters where people had reason to suspect that their banks were fully liquid and found out the hard way their stable coins were fully liquid, found out the hard way that they weren't. So in my opinion, it was a reasonable compromise to preclude any more drastic opposition to stablecoins. They at least give them the opportunity to exist and take part in the Federal Reserve System if they have 100% reserves. And the other thing about that arrangement is, unlike the case with actual stablecoins, monitoring is a cinch. The Federal Reserve always knows if you're holding what your reserves, its participants have, because the reserves are in an account at the Fed. So they don't know, nobody knows. So that was my suggestion. So I'm not advocating bond deposit requirements, which are a different kettle of fish. And by the way, bond values fluctuate. So they're not the same. If you're holding a long maturity bond with a coupon of X% and rates go up, that bond is going to depreciate.
Silicon Valley Bank discovered that, right?
Yes, and the Federal Reserve has discovered it. It's taken immense losses, but of course, not being your average bank, it doesn't have to worry about it. But bonds are not the same as reserves, as actual cash reserves. Anyway, what I think about the legislation is that I think of it in the same spirit as my suggestion. If it's either that or have stable coins suppressed entirely or regulated out of existence, I would prefer this legislation. And the reason is that I think stable coins have the potential to be beneficial, and we should give them a chance. Rule out the worst possible disasters and fraud and all that, but don't rule them out altogether, because we really haven't seen them achieve what they might achieve. Let's give them a chance.
All right. If you have a few more minutes, we've got a few more questions. Is that okay?
Sure. Go ahead. Sure.
Moulton has, why did the Great Depression last as long as it did? What would have been the best and most effective response to offset the depression and effectuate recovery?
Yeah. Well, I've talked about some of that. Let me just remind our questioner that the length of the depression varied a lot from country to country. And as I mentioned earlier, there were two countries that were the biggest laggards, and one of them was the United States, and the other one was France. And the reason they were laggards was because, to a large extent, because they pursued poor solutions to recovery. Now, it should be said that in the United States case, we also had a deeper depression because of our banking crisis. That might have made our recovery take longer anyway, but it didn't have to take as long as it actually did. Now, ending a depression takes time. If it's deep, it's going to take longer. There's no way around that. But as far as what I consider the best remedies, I've already said that I don't think doing nothing is acceptable or workable. I think you have to get spending up. You have to get, depressions involve at least proximately a collapse in spending. People spend less, firms earn less, firms hire less, and so on. You've got to get spending back up, because getting prices to all adjust down without being able somehow to magically rewrite long-term contracts painlessly is not practical. And to get spending up, there are various possibilities. The most desirable is monetary expansion, because it involves less interference with the forms that spending takes, what money gets spent on. There's less opportunity for waste. That's not to say that there should be no role for fiscal policy, which is government increasing its spending. On fiscal policy, I see a lot of merit in what was a very old-fashioned approach to countercyclical fiscal policy. It was the one Hoover favored and many economists favored. It's just you save up for a rainy day. You don't save up. You may run surpluses, but saving up here means keep some government, public works, and other projects that it has to undertake anyway, keep them aside, and then really do them all when you get a downturn in the economy. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for governments to do as a fiscal answer. I'm also a believer in relief spending. If people can't get jobs any other way, give them other jobs. Certainly give them a check. Don't let them starve. And that itself is a source of demand. But most of all, I think the most effective, potentially, and most desirable solution is monetary stimulus. It's not always easy. If interest rates hit zero, it can be very hard to use monetary stimulus. But there are also ways to try to avoid having an economy reach the zero lower bound so that you don't have to deal with that contingency. Anything that gets real interest rates up high and makes the economy more productive reduces the odds of that happening, for starters. So obviously, from my talk with Yaron, there are many things I think you have to avoid to not make a depression worse. And that includes interfering with price adjustment to the extent that prices are trying to struggle their way to a new equilibrium levels. Then don't interfere with that. Certainly don't try to force firms to pay higher wage rates or raise their product prices. Let them be induced to do those things by the fact that their revenues are being increased through other kinds of policies. So these are some of the steps. In the 1930s, of course, it was very important to let that gold come into the country and make sure it does as much to stimulate bank credit, lending, and spending as possible, instead of worrying that it's going to cause an artificial boom. Keynes is said to have quipped, I can't find a primary source for this, that when the authorities put the brakes on gold stimulus,
Yeah.
he said, they profess to fear that for which they dare not hope, meaning rising prices. And and a boom, right?
You were quite articulate.
Yeah.
We
But
were-
a boom is what you want to have a boom
You
if
want to
you're
brew.
in a depression. Maybe you don't want it to go too far, but you sort of want to have it as something booming.
Absolutely.
So they're both negative lessons and positive lessons to be learned from the 1930s. If I had to say though, one of the biggest lessons for that people should remember is this: every time we have another depression or recession, people say, let's look at the New Deal. They solved it. Let's do what
Yeah.
they did. No, the biggest lesson we can have from the New Deal is that we know more than they did about fighting recessions. We're still not very good at it,
Yep.
but they didn't know about fiscal stimulus. They didn't know about monetary stimulus. They knew all kinds of things that were wrong. And so that is, generally speaking, with some few exceptions, there is very little that the New Dealers have to teach us about fighting depression. So if we need innovative steps, let's not look
Yeah.
there.
Yep.
That's not, maybe we do need new innovative ideas for fighting depressions. I'm sure we could use some, but that is not where you're going to get them. That's a place to look for innovative ideas that didn't work.
Yep.
And for the failure to use things that arguably do help.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. Glad for War. What is your centralized evaluation of panics, depressions in the 19th century? What are the most important things to know about them?
Well, I think I already answered that, Yaron, by saying that bad currency and banking laws were a very important part of the problem. A lot of people say, "Oh, the gold standard. Look at all the crises in the United States that happened under the gold standard before the Federal Reserve Act was passed and the Fed supposedly was going to fix everything." But they don't understand that it couldn't be the gold standard. How do I know it couldn't be the gold standard? Well, Canada was on the very same gold dollar.
Yep.
Canada was bound to be buffeted, by the way, by anything bad that happened to the US economy.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, for the most part, they evaded all of those crises. They simply didn't have the record of banking crises that we had. Now, how could they escape with the same gold dollar? Well, The answer is there were other differences between the Canadian banking and currency system and the US system. And so if you want to know why we had crises in the US, you better look at those other things.
Yep.
And there were plenty of them, and they were bad. We had stupid banking laws. We had really bad banking laws. That, I think, is the most important thing to learn about US history, at least to judge by the wrong things people often say. And this goes back to that insularity I was complaining about before. These people who say, oh, the gold standard was, the problem before the creation of the Fed, or only the creation of the Fed could have addressed the banking crisis, they don't know the reality of what was causing U.S. crises, and they know nothing about even the country just to the north of us and what happened there. If they did, they would be aware that their arguments are not, really not very satisfactory explanations for what happened.
So Remo asks, thoughts on libertarians who are against fractional reserve banking?
Um, well, I won't just limit. There are other people who are opposed to fractional reserve banking too. So let's not just limit this to libertarians. And of course, many libertarians aren't. But I'll talk mainly about the Rothbardians, because they are the most notorious, the followers of Rothbard, of whom there are many, of course. And the big problem with them, and with Rothbard himself, is that they've made a complete botched job of the banking law. They just don't understand how fractional reserve banking works, what its legal foundation is. They're very confused about what it is that a bank deposit entitles its holder to. It's not a property right to the money you brought to the bank. Mm-hmm. It is a deposit credit that entitles you to a certain sum on demand. The money you bring to your bank, the banker takes possession of that, and this has been true this has been legally the case since ancient. This goes all the way back to ancient law. Basically, if you went to a money changer, a bank, or anyone else, there were two things you could do with a bag. You have a bunch of coins. All right, let's say you have a bunch of coins. I write about this in an article, the title of which, it's called the bagging rule, bagging law. If you went to a bank with a bunch of loose coins and put them over the counter and said, here, those coins became the property of the banker. Now, he might give you, presumably he would give you a little something, a bank note or a little contract that says you can have an equivalent amount of coins anytime you want it. That would be a demand deposit. Or if you had the bank note, then you have the right to redeem that note, or someone else who gets it can do so. And that's all. But those coins aren't yours anymore. And there was a very practical reason for this, because the only way the bank could, honor the commitment to give you back your property would be by giving you back exactly the same coins.
Yeah.
So what if you don't want the banker to own your money? Well, the law was very simple on that and very specific. You bring them in a sealed container. It could be a bag, could be a box. And you say, here, I want you to store these coins for me. And then they're not going to touch them. Then they're still your property. And you get a bailment contract, which is a storage contract. And I've had articles on this too. The two types of contracts, very easy to see the difference. A banknote doesn't say the same thing as a bailment contract. Mm-hmm. It says we promise to pay the bearer on demand X amount. A bailment contract says we have this stuff for you in our warehouse and we're storing. Very different. Now, Rothbard and company have totally twisted all this history. And it's tempting to say, I will say it, they lied. And so you have people like Hans Hermann Hoppe running around saying, oh, the banks are replicating titles to the same property. No, when I bring money to a bank, when you bring money to your bank, you are parting with that property and you're getting something else, a financial instrument in exchange that doesn't entitle you to money, but doesn't entitle you to that same money because you don't have property rights to that anymore. So there's no duplication of titles. By the way, most, not all, but most banking contracts, you look at your depositor agreement with your bank, many of them, I don't say all because I've seen some exceptions, many of them very clearly state, hey, this is not a bailment contract. We are your debtor and you are our creditor. That very clearly means that you've made a loan to them of money and you're entitled to get the same value of money back with interest or whatever. It does not have anything to do with storage. Anyway, they're all wrong about that. Now, they're also wrong about the economic consequences of fractional reserve banking. I don't mind the mistakes they make there because they're more pardonable. But when it comes to claiming that there's a fraudulent basis to all banking, it's just false. And there's no two ways around it. It's bad banking history, bad banking law. And this, again, goes back to ancient times. So this is not some innovation that some crooked judge came up with in the Victorian era. This is another story Rothbard tells about a case where the judges perverted the law. No, you look at that case, he is simply abiding by legal doctrines that already were many centuries old by the time.
Yeah. Paul asks, what effect did tariffs have on the Great Depression?
Oh, gosh, this is something people debate a whole lot. I can't claim to have any novel opinions about this. I will simply say that the tariffs in question are the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs passed under the Hoover administration, 1932. And they were a pretty serious round of tariffs, to be sure, though not as bad as Trump's. And they started with Hoover trying to get some protection for farmers who were struggling, had been struggling ever since the end of World War I. And it ballooned into a much more widespread set of tariffs, thanks to log rolling. And then, of course, that invited retaliation by the countries that the tariffs were imposed upon. So you really ended up with a big tariff mess. And many people think that it did a lot of harm. I would be inclined to think so, except that person whose work on this subject I trust most, which is Doug Irwin. And he's no friend of tariffs.
Yeah.
He says he doesn't think the contribution to the Depression was very great. And if Doug says it, I hesitate to, say otherwise. I'm not sure, but I'm just not sure. But I do think that Doug's opinion should be taken seriously.
They didn't have a positive effect. We know that. And then it's
no, we can rule that out. The question is how big the negative.
Yeah. This is the last question. It's actually a good last question. What is an achievable first step towards freer banking that advocates could focus on today? One which wouldn't cause major displacement and disruption and might be actual chance of passing.
Well, there's a lot of confusion about what free banking means, and that's because free banking today doesn't mean what it meant in the 19th century. In the 19th century, under the gold standard, it meant there was no central bank. It was an alternative to central banking where banknotes are competitively issued. There's no one source of currency, and there's no bank that is supplying reserves of any kind to any other bank. Now, today, of course, the gold standard's gone. Our basic money is the fiat money issued by the Federal Reserve System. There isn't anything else. And so our dollar rests on this foundation of, as it were, Federal Reserve paper and digital book entries and nothing more. So now you can have free banking on a Federal Reserve fiat dollar where you let the banks issue IOUs that are claims to dollars. It could be banknotes, but it more likely would be stable coins, right? And that's what we're talking about with the legislation. And of course, to have true free banking, you have to get rid of other obnoxious regulations. We have gotten rid of some. We got rid of barriers to branch banking, which used to be extremely obnoxious. On the other hand, we've introduced and ratcheted up deposit guarantees in a big way. The biggest departure today of our modern system from free banking, apart from the fact that we have a fiat standard, which is huge, is that we have both deposit insurance and tremendous implicit guarantees to banks that are too big to fail. Mm-hmm. You can't have free banking unless you roll those things back. So now I'm in a quandary, because the question was, what can we most easily accomplish? And now I'm talking about what most badly needs to be accomplished, which is to get rid of these guarantees, implicit and explicit, or you're not. The main problems in the U.S. banking system today, instead of being lack of branch banking and other pesky regulations that interfere with what banks can do, today the main problem is government guarantees that encourage them to take excessive risks. Yep. That is number one now. It's really changed since before the 30s. The government's screwing things up one way or the other, but it's changed the way it does them. Now, I don't know any easy way to get rid of these guarantees. I really don't. I have argued, and most recently, my colleagues at Cato have argued again, that the Fed really doesn't need to be in the last resort lending business in the sense of providing loans to any specific institutions. Mm-hmm. It should stick to providing liquidity in the marketplace through its open market operations when necessary, quantitative easing, whatever you want to call it, and of course regulating interest rates. But through setting the interest rate on reserves, it should be taken out of the business of direct lending. That can be done. And it shouldn't prevent banks. It shouldn't make it easy for solvent banks to fail. Mm-hmm. If there's enough liquidity in the marketplace, solvent banks can borrow from other solvent banks. And that's been demonstrated many, many times in the past. It's also been demonstrated historically that there are very few banks that suffer and fail simply because people run on them out of sheer panic. Bank runs are almost always runs on banks that are already in trouble. And they usually start with the smart money. The people you see lined up at the bank, they're the last ones. It's the smart money has already wired its money away by the time they show up at the front door. And that smart money usually knows when banks are sound and when they aren't, and stages runs on the unsound ones. So we need more bank runs, actually, and less last resort lending by the Fed. And those are some of the essential steps and very hard to take steps to get toward free banking. I wish I could say, the things that are easy are far less important. Yep. There are a lot of dumb, pesky regulations out there still that might be easier to get rid of. Dodd-Frank is bad legislation. My colleague, Mark Calabria, is very good about why and the myths behind its passage. But, well, I'm going to cop out and say what I think we badly need to do without pretending I've answered the question about what's easy to do.
I don't think anything's easy. So, George, we've taken up a lot of your time. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Not at all. I love the opportunity, Yaron. It's my pleasure.
We should do this again, and because there's a lot to talk about. I mean, there's a ton going on in the world of finance. Oh, yeah. Fun to talk about. So, remind everybody, the book is Forced Dawn: The New Deal and the Promise of Recovery, 1933 to 1947. You can find it pretty much everywhere you can find books, and you can find George's work. Where's the best place for them to go?
Oh, well, nowadays, of course, it's the internet, basically, and a lot of my stuff is out there. A lot of my essays for the Cato Institute are online. They've been transferred to Cato at Liberty from the old Alt-M site that I used to run. And a lot of my papers are out there. My academic papers, they can find listed on Google and elsewhere, JSTOR. They may need a university library access to get to some of them, but there's plenty of stuff out there, easy to look up. Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, I know it's nighttime where you are, so have a great night, and I look
Thank
forward to
you.
seeing you sometime in
I
person. It'll be
hope
fun.
we will get together, Yaron. Thank you very much for having me on this show. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.